He thought he could humiliate her in front of everyone. But he had no idea he was about to play the most dangerous game of his life. The ballroom shimmered under golden chandeliers, the kind that reflected status more than light, and every seat was filled with people who knew exactly who Victor Hale was. A Grandmaster. A legend. A man who hadn't lost a public exhibition match in over a decade. Cameras were set. Phones were raised. The air carried that quiet, electric anticipation reserved for moments people believed they would remember forever. Victor adjusted his tailored navy jacket, his expression calm, almost bored, as he scanned the crowd for his next opponent. He didn't need a challenge tonight. He needed entertainment. "Let's make this interesting," he said, his voice smooth, practiced, carrying easily across the room. His eyes drifted past suited investors, eager students, and local chess enthusiasts, before landing on someone no one else had noticed twice. She stood near the far wall, slightly behind the crowd, a simple woman in a faded gray sweater, quietly wiping down a side table as if she didn't belong in the same room as the rest of them. Emily Carter. No one there knew her name. No one cared to ask. To them, she was just part of the background, another invisible worker ensuring the event ran smoothly. Victor's lips curved into a faint smile. "You," he said, pointing casually, as if selecting a prop rather than a person. "Come join me." The room reacted instantly. A few people laughed. Others exchanged amused glances. It was harmless, they thought. Just a bit of fun. Emily paused, the cloth still in her hand, her posture straight but hesitant. For a moment, it seemed like she might refuse. But then she set the cloth down carefully, wiped her hands, and walked forward. Each step was measured, quiet, almost too calm for someone stepping into a spotlight she never asked for. Victor gestured to the chair across from him, his tone light, but edged with something sharper beneath. "Don't worry," he said, leaning back slightly. "Just move the pieces however you like." More laughter. Soft, polite, but unmistakably dismissive. Emily sat down. Her fingers rested lightly on the edge of the board, not trembling, not fidgeting, just still. Her eyes lifted briefly, meeting Victor's for the first time. There was no challenge in them. No fear either. Just something unreadable. The arbiter nodded, signaling the start. Victor made the first move without hesitation. A standard opening, something elegant but predictable, designed more for display than difficulty. Emily looked at the board. A second passed. Then she moved. Simple, clean, efficient. Victor barely glanced at it before continuing, his rhythm steady, his confidence intact. This was routine, a performance. Move after move, he played quickly, barely needing to think, occasionally glancing at the audience as if inviting them to share in the joke. But by the third exchange, something shifted. It was subtle, almost invisible. A slight pause, a flicker in his eyes. He looked down again, this time longer. Emily sat exactly as before, her posture unchanged, her expression calm, her fingers resting lightly beside the board as if she had all the time in the world. Victor made his next move, slower now. Deliberate. Emily responded almost instantly. The room began to quiet, though no one could quite explain why. The laughter faded into murmurs, then into something else entirely. Attention. Focus. A few phones lowered. People leaned forward. Victor's jaw tightened just slightly as he adjusted in his seat, his confidence no longer effortless but forced, recalculated. He studied the board again, longer this time. Something wasn't lining up the way it should. Positions he expected to control felt constrained. Options that should have been obvious now required thought. Real thought. Emily's next move came like the others. Precise, unhurried, undeniable. Victor blinked. For the first time that evening, he didn't look at the audience. He looked only at her. And somewhere in the back of the room, a voice barely above a whisper broke the silence. "Wait, that can't be." Victor froze mid-motion, his hand hovering just above a piece as a realization, faint but growing, began to take shape. And in that moment, the room didn't just grow quiet. It began to understand that this was no longer a joke. Victor Hale had built his reputation on certainty, on seeing 10 moves ahead before his opponent even understood the first. But now, sitting across from a woman he had chosen as a joke, that certainty began to slip through his fingers one quiet move at a time. His hand finally lowered, completing the move he had hesitated on, but it lacked the effortless confidence that had defined him moments ago. A subtle shift rippled through the room, not loud, not dramatic, but undeniable. People leaned closer. A man in the front row adjusted his glasses. A woman who had been scrolling on her phone slowly lowered it, her eyes narrowing at the board. Emily did not rush. She studied the position for a brief moment, her gaze steady, as if she was not just looking at the pieces, but at something far beyond them. Then she moved. Clean, precise, intentional. Victor's eyes snapped back to the board, sharper now, more focused. That move had not been random. It had not been beginner's luck. It had purpose. He shifted in his chair, straightening slightly, the relaxed posture gone, replaced by something tighter, more controlled. He reached for his next piece, but paused again, calculating. For the first time that evening, he was no longer playing for the audience. He was playing to understand. The silence deepened. Even the faint clinking of glasses from the catering staff seemed to fade into the background as the tension in the room thickened. Victor made his next move, careful now, testing. Emily responded almost instantly. No hesitation. No uncertainty. Just another precise adjustment that quietly tightened the invisible pressure around him. A faint crease appeared between Victor's brows. He leaned forward, elbows resting lightly on the table, his eyes scanning the board with increasing intensity. Lines he had relied on for years were no longer opening the way they should. Control, once firmly in his grasp, now felt contested. Across from him, Emily remained composed, her breathing steady, her posture unchanged. If she felt the weight of the room, she did not show it. If she noticed the shift in Victor's demeanor, she gave no sign. Another move, then another. Each exchange chipped away at the illusion that this was a performance. The crowd felt it now, that subtle but growing realization that something unexpected was unfolding right in front of them. A whisper traveled from one side of the room to the other, quiet but charged with curiosity. Is she actually good? Victor heard it. Of course he did. And it tightened something inside him. He made a sharper move this time, more aggressive, an attempt to reassert control, to remind both himself and the audience who he was. The Grandmaster. The authority. The one who dictated the flow of the game. Emily looked at the board, then at his last move, and for the first time, the smallest shift appeared in her expression. Not fear. Not hesitation. Recognition. As if she had been waiting for exactly this. Her fingers moved again, placing a piece with quiet finality. Victor froze. Not completely, not outwardly enough for everyone to notice, but just long enough for those watching closely to see it. That move had changed the structure of the entire board. It was no longer about defense. It was positioning, strategy, depth. Victor leaned back slightly, exhaling through his nose, his eyes never leaving the board. This was no accident, no coincidence. He reached for his glass of water, took a small sip, then set it down with controlled precision. The performance mask returned, but it was thinner now, stretched over something far more serious. He looked up at Emily, studying her properly for the first time. The plain sweater, the calm eyes, the quiet presence that had blended so easily into the background just minutes ago. None of it made sense anymore. Have you played before? He asked, his voice lighter than he felt. Almost casual, but edged with something sharper beneath. Emily met his gaze, her expression unchanged. A little, she said softly. A ripple moved through the audience, not laughter this time, but something else. Suspicion, realization. Victor nodded slowly, as if accepting the answer, but his mind was already racing, recalculating everything he thought he understood about the situation. He returned his focus to the board, but now every move carried weight. Every decision mattered. And across from him, the woman he had chosen as a joke sat perfectly still, as if she had known all along exactly how this would unfold. Somewhere near the back, the same voice from before whispered again, slightly louder this time, enough for others to hear. Emily Carter. I think I have heard that name before. Victor's hand hovered above the board once more, but this time, it did not move right away. Because for the first time in years, he was not certain of what came next. The difference between a performance and a real game is simple, and Victor Hale felt it now with unsettling clarity. In a performance you control the narrative, but in a real game the board decides the truth. His fingers hovered above a knight, then withdrew slightly as his mind raced through variations that refused to settle into certainty. Across from him, Emily Carter remained still, her presence almost unnervingly calm, as if the growing tension in the room belonged to everyone else but her. The faint whisper of her name continued to ripple through the crowd, gaining weight with each passing second. Emily Carter. Where have I heard that before? Someone murmured again, this time louder, pulling more attention away from the spectacle and toward the possibility of something far more significant. Victor finally committed to his move, placing the knight with careful precision, but the confidence behind it was no longer absolute. It was cautious, calculated, defensive. The shift was subtle, but to those who understood chess, it was unmistakable. Emily glanced at the board, and for a brief moment, her eyes softened, almost as if she recognized the intention behind his move before it fully settled into place. Then she responded, not quickly this time, but deliberately, her fingers guiding a piece forward with quiet certainty. The effect was immediate. Victor's eyes narrowed. That move did not just answer his last play. It anticipated his next three. A faint tension spread through his shoulders as he leaned closer, his world narrowing to 64 squares and the woman sitting across from him. The audience could feel it now, that invisible line where curiosity turns into disbelief. No one was laughing anymore. No one was checking their phones. The room had become completely still, as if even the air itself was waiting to see what would happen next. Victor adjusted his posture again, sitting straighter, his expression tightening as he recalculated. He had faced prodigies before, young talents with sharp instincts and quick pattern recognition. But this was different. This was not speed. This was depth. Emily's moves were not reactive. They were inevitable. He reached for his queen, hesitated, then chose a different path, one that sacrificed a small advantage to regain positional control. It was a decision born from experience, from years of navigating complex positions under pressure. But as soon as the piece touched the board, something in his expression shifted. Doubt. Emily saw it. Not directly, not with any visible reaction, but in the way her next move came with absolute clarity. She did not pause. She did not reconsider. She simply placed her piece, and in doing so, tightened the structure around him. In a way that felt almost intentional. Victor blinked, then leaned back slightly, exhaling slowly as he studied the new position. It was not a trap in the traditional sense. There was no immediate threat, no obvious tactic. But the longer he looked, the more he realized that every option he had led to a narrowing path, each one subtly worse than the last. The realization settled over him like a quiet weight. He was no longer guiding the game. He was responding to it. Around them, the audience began to shift, not physically, but emotionally. The energy had changed. What began as amusement had transformed into something far more serious. A man near the center of the room leaned toward his companion and whispered, "That structure. That is not beginner play." Another voice responded, barely audible, "That is not intermediate either." The whispers grew, soft but insistent, weaving through the silence like a current. Victor heard them all, even if he did not acknowledge them. His focus returned to Emily, studying her more closely now, searching for any sign of hesitation, any crack in the calm composure she maintained so effortlessly. But there was nothing. No tell. No uncertainty. Just that same steady presence, as if she had already seen the outcome and was simply allowing the steps to unfold. He made another move, slower now, each piece placed with deliberate care, but the rhythm was gone. The fluidity that had once defined his play had been replaced by something heavier, more deliberate. Emily responded again, and this time, the shift was undeniable. Victor's hand froze midair, hovering above the board as his eyes locked onto the new configuration. For a long moment, he did not move. He simply stared, his mind racing through possibilities that refused to resolve in his favor. The room held its breath. Somewhere in the back, the whisper returned, no longer uncertain, no longer questioning. She is not just good, she is controlling him. Victor slowly lowered his hand, but instead of making a move, he leaned back, his gaze lifting from the board to Emily's face. And in that moment, something unspoken passed between them, something deeper than the game itself. Because for the first time since this match began, Victor Hale was not thinking about how to win. He was trying to understand who he was playing against. By now, everyone in that room could feel it, the quiet, undeniable shift from spectacle to something far more serious. And Victor Hale, a man who had built his entire career on controlling pressure, was beginning to feel it press back against him. His eyes returned to the board, but the confidence that once guided every move had been replaced by something heavier, something cautious, almost reluctant. The position in front of him was no longer familiar territory. It was narrowing, closing in, each square carrying consequences he could not easily escape. Across from him, Emily Carter remained exactly as she had been from the beginning, composed, still, her presence grounded in a calm that did not seek attention but commanded it anyway. Victor reached forward, his fingers brushing lightly against a piece before committing to the move, but even that small action carried hesitation now, a pause that had never existed before. The audience noticed. Of course they did. The Grandmaster who once moved like clockwork was now thinking, calculating, second-guessing. A faint murmur moved through the room, not loud enough to break the silence, but strong enough to carry a single realization. This was no longer entertainment. This was a contest. Emily studied the board, her gaze steady, absorbing not just the current position but the direction of the game itself. There was no rush in her movements, no attempt to impress, no sign that she even acknowledged the weight of what was happening around her. When she moved, it was with quiet certainty, a simple adjustment that, to the untrained eye, looked harmless, but to Victor, it landed with unmistakable clarity. His lips pressed together. That move had not attacked anything directly. It had done something worse. It had taken space, control, time. He leaned back slightly, his mind racing through possibilities that continued to collapse under their own limitations. Every path he considered seemed to lead to the same outcome, a gradual tightening, a slow loss of freedom. The room held its breath as Victor leaned forward again, his elbows resting lightly on the table, his entire focus consumed by the board. The lights above reflected faintly against the polished surface, casting small glints across the pieces, but the visual brilliance of the setting no longer mattered. Everything had narrowed to this moment. A Grandmaster searching for clarity, and a woman who already seemed to have it. Victor made another move, this time more aggressive, an attempt to disrupt the structure, to create imbalance, to force complications that might reopen the game. It was a calculated risk, one that had saved him countless times before. But as soon as his hand left the piece, he felt it. Not regret. Not yet. But uncertainty. Emily's eyes followed the move, and for the first time, there was the faintest shift in her posture, not a reaction, but an acknowledgement. As if she had expected this moment all along. Her hand moved slowly, deliberately, guiding a piece forward with absolute precision. The effect was immediate. Victor's eyes widened just slightly, not enough for most to notice, but enough for those watching closely to feel the change. That move did not just answer his aggression. It absorbed it, redirected it, turned it into something that worked against him. A quiet ripple of realization spread through the audience. The whispers grew sharper now, more focused. She saw that coming. Someone murmured. No, she invited it, another replied. Victor sat still, staring at the board, his mind racing through lines that now felt increasingly constrained. The deeper he calculated, the clearer it became. He was no longer dictating the pace. He was reacting to it. And worse, every reaction seemed to bring him closer to something he could not yet fully see, but could undeniably feel. Emily remained silent, her hands resting lightly in her lap now, her gaze steady, patient, almost detached from the tension building around her. She was not rushing him. She did not need to. Time was no longer his advantage. Seconds stretched longer than they should. The room remained completely still, the kind of silence that only forms when something important is unfolding. Victor finally exhaled, long and controlled, before reaching forward again, making a move that was careful, defensive, a subtle attempt to stabilize what was quickly becoming unstable. But the moment the piece settled, he knew. It was not enough. Emily moved again, and this time, the shift was undeniable. Victor's hand stopped mid-motion, his eyes locking onto the board as the full weight of the position revealed itself piece by piece, like a truth that could no longer be ignored. There it was. Not a dramatic attack, not a sudden collapse, but something far more precise. A position where every move he had left only made things worse. A position where the outcome was no longer a question of if, But when? The room felt it too, even those who did not fully understand the game. A tension, a quiet realization that something irreversible had just happened. Victor slowly leaned back in his chair, his gaze lifting from the board to Emily once more, searching, questioning, trying to reconcile the simple woman in front of him with the undeniable mastery she was displaying. And in that moment, as the silence deepened and the weight of the game settled fully into place, one truth became impossible to ignore. He was no longer playing to win. He was playing to survive. The truth about pressure is that it does not arrive all at once. It builds quietly, tightening inch by inch until even the strongest begin to feel it. And Victor Hale was feeling every ounce of it now. The board in front of him had transformed into something unfamiliar, not chaotic, not overwhelming, but controlled in a way that left him with fewer and fewer choices. Each piece he moved felt like a concession, each decision narrowing the path ahead. He leaned forward again, his fingers resting lightly against his temple as he studied the position, searching for something, anything that could shift the balance back in his favor. But the deeper he looked, the clearer it became. There was no sudden escape waiting to be discovered, no hidden tactic that would reverse the flow, only a slow, deliberate inevitability. Across from him, Emily Carter remained still, her presence unchanged, as if the growing tension around them existed in a different world entirely. Her eyes rested on the board, calm and focused, not with urgency, but with quiet understanding. She was not reacting to the game. She was guiding it. Victor finally made his move, carefully, deliberately, placing the piece as if hoping precision alone could reclaim control. But the moment his hand withdrew, the weakness in the position revealed itself, not dramatically, not loudly, but with a subtle clarity that only made it more undeniable. A faint sound escaped somewhere in the crowd, not quite a gasp, but close enough to carry meaning. Emily's response came without hesitation. One move. Simple. Clean. And with it, the entire structure shifted again. Victor's eyes locked onto the board, and for the first time, the realization was no longer forming. It had arrived. He saw it now. Not just the immediate consequence, but the sequence that followed. 3 moves. 4. 5. Each one tightening the position further. Each one removing another option, another possibility. His hand hovered above the board, but it did not move. The room had gone completely silent, the kind of silence that feels heavier than noise, pressing in from every side. No one spoke. No one shifted. Even the smallest sounds seemed to disappear, as if the entire space understood that something final was approaching. Victor slowly exhaled, his shoulders lowering just slightly, not in defeat, not yet, but in acknowledgement. He made his move, the only move left that delayed the inevitable. But even as the piece settled into place, he knew it was not enough. Emily looked at the board, her gaze steady, and then she moved again. This time, there was no ambiguity, no subtlety. The position crystallized into something undeniable. Victor's hand stopped mid-motion, his eyes fixed on the arrangement in front of him as the final pattern revealed itself with quiet precision. Checkmate. The word did not need to be spoken. It existed in the space between them, in the stillness that followed, in the way Victor did not reach for another piece. For a long moment, he did not move at all. He simply stared at the board, his mind tracing the path that had led here, replaying each decision, each moment where the balance had shifted without him fully realizing it. Across from him, Emily remained calm, her hands resting lightly in her lap, her expression unchanged. She did not celebrate. She did not react. She simply waited. The room held its breath, suspended in the aftermath of something no one had expected to witness. Then, slowly, Victor leaned back in his chair, his gaze lifting from the board to meet hers. There was no anger in his expression, no denial, only a quiet, undeniable recognition. The kind that does not come easily to someone who has spent a lifetime being certain. A faint murmur began to rise from the crowd, not loud, not chaotic, but filled with disbelief, with realization, with something close to awe. And then, from somewhere near the back, a voice broke through, clear enough this time for everyone to hear. That is Emily Carter, the prodigy who disappeared 15 years ago. The words settled over the room like a final piece falling into place. Victor's expression shifted, just slightly. As the name connected, as memory caught up with reality. He looked at her again, really looked this time, and the pieces aligned in a way that had nothing to do with the board between them. The quiet woman, the steady hands, the impossible precision. It all made sense now. The silence deepened once more, not out of tension this time, but out of understanding. And in that moment, as the weight of what had just happened settled fully into the room, one truth became impossible to ignore. Respect had not been demanded. It had been earned, move by move, in complete silence. For a long moment, no one moved, as if the outcome itself needed time to settle into reality. And Victor Hale, a man who had spent his entire life commanding rooms exactly like this one, now sat in complete stillness, his defeat resting quietly between 64 squares of undeniable truth. The murmurs that had begun moments ago slowly grew, not chaotic, not disrespectful, but filled with a kind of stunned recognition that could not be contained. Emily Carter, the prodigy, the name traveled through the crowd, gaining clarity, gaining weight, until it was no longer a question but a shared understanding. Victor lowered his gaze back to the board, tracing the final position one more time, not searching for errors, but acknowledging its precision. There had been no trick, no lucky break. Every move had been intentional. Every choice had led here. He exhaled slowly, then reached forward, not to continue the game, but to gently straighten a piece that had shifted slightly during the final sequence. It was a small gesture, but one that carried meaning. Control, even in defeat. Across from him, Emily remained composed, her posture unchanged, her hands still resting lightly in her lap. She had not claimed victory with words. She did not need to. The board had already spoken. Victor finally looked up, meeting her eyes again, and this time there was no trace of condescension left, no performance, no distance. Only respect, clear and undeniable. "You are Emily Carter," he said, his voice quieter now, but steady. It was not a question. Emily gave the smallest nod, her expression calm, almost neutral, as if the name carried less weight for her than it did for everyone else in the room. A ripple moved through the audience, sharper this time, as the confirmation settled in. Some faces lit with recognition, others with disbelief, and a few with the quiet realization that they had witnessed something rare, something they would not forget. Victor leaned back slightly, his hands coming together in front of him, fingers interlaced as he studied her with a new perspective. "You disappeared," he continued, his tone measured, not accusatory, but genuinely curious. 15 years ago. The entire chess world was asking what happened. The room leaned in again, drawn not by spectacle now, but by the story unfolding in front of them. Emily's gaze shifted briefly to the board, then back to Victor, her voice soft but clear. "I stopped playing," she said. There was no drama in her words. No explanation. Just a simple statement that somehow carried more weight than a long answer ever could. Victor's brow furrowed slightly, as if trying to reconcile that simplicity with everything he knew about talent, about ambition, about what it meant to reach the top of a field and then walk away. "People do not just stop at that level," he said quietly. Emily held his gaze, her expression steady, and for the first time, there was the faintest hint of something deeper behind her calm, not regret, not bitterness, but something grounded, something resolved. "Sometimes they do," she replied. The room fell silent again, but this silence was different. It was not built on tension or anticipation. It was built on understanding, on the quiet recognition that there were stories behind people that could not be seen at a glance, stories that no title or appearance could fully explain. Victor nodded slowly, absorbing her words, then glanced around the room, taking in the faces that had once expected entertainment and now carried something entirely different. Reflection. He turned back to Emily, his expression composed, but sincere. "I invited you here as a joke," he said, his voice steady, carrying just enough to reach the edges of the room. "That was my mistake." There was no defensiveness in the admission, no attempt to soften it, just truth. Emily did not respond immediately. She simply looked at him, her eyes steady, and then gave a small nod, not as acceptance, not as dismissal, but as acknowledgement. The kind that does not need to linger. Victor allowed a faint breath of a smile to appear, not one of arrogance, but of recognition, as if he understood something now that he had not before. He reached out, extending his hand across the table. "Thank you," he said simply. Emily looked at his hand for a brief moment, then reached forward and shook it, her grip light but firm, her expression unchanged. The gesture was quiet, almost understated, but in that moment, it carried more meaning than any applause could. And yet, the applause came anyway, slowly at first, then building, not loud or overwhelming, but genuine, filling the room with a sound that no longer celebrated a performance, but honored a truth that had revealed itself piece by piece. Victor released her hand and leaned back once more, his gaze returning briefly to the board, then back to her. The game was over, but something else had begun, something unspoken, something that extended far beyond the pieces they had just moved. And as the room settled into that quiet aftermath, one thing became clear to everyone who had witnessed it. The most powerful moves are not always the ones made on the board, but the ones that reveal who you truly are when the world is watching. The applause faded, but the silence that followed carried something deeper, something heavier, as if the room itself was still trying to process what it had just witnessed. And in that lingering stillness, Victor Hale understood that the game had ended, but the consequences of it had only just begun. He remained seated for a moment longer, his gaze drifting across the crowd, noticing how differently they looked at him now, not with less respect, but with a new kind of awareness, one that could not be undone. For years, he had stood as the unquestioned authority in rooms like this, the one who defined excellence, who set the standard. But tonight, that image had been quietly reshaped, not through failure, but through truth. Across from him, Emily Carter stood slowly, her movements as calm and deliberate as they had been throughout the game. She did not seek attention, did not acknowledge the eyes that followed her now with a mixture of admiration and curiosity. To her, it seemed, this moment was not a victory to hold on to, but simply a moment that had passed. Victor rose. As well, a fraction of a second after her, his posture composed, his expression thoughtful. For the first time in years, he felt the absence of something he had always carried without question, certainty. And in its place, there was something else, something quieter, but far more enduring. Respect. The host of the event stepped forward hesitantly, clearly unsure how to regain control of a situation that had moved far beyond the planned program. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his voice slightly unsteady, "I think we have just witnessed something extraordinary." A soft murmur of agreement moved through the crowd, but no one clapped this time. It was not that kind of moment. It was something more reflective, more personal. Victor glanced toward Emily, who had already begun to step away from the table, her path leading back toward the edges of the room where she had started, as if she intended to return to the same quiet place she had occupied before any of this began. "Wait," Victor said, his voice carrying just enough to stop her. Emily paused, turning slightly, her expression unchanged. The room leaned in once more, not out of curiosity now, but out of genuine interest in what would happen next. Victor took a step closer, not as a grandmaster addressing an opponent, but as one individual speaking to another. "You could come back," he said, his tone measured, sincere. "The world would welcome you. More than that, it needs players like you." The words hung in the air, carrying the weight of someone who understood exactly what he was offering. Recognition, opportunity, a return to a stage where her talent would no longer be invisible. Emily looked at him for a moment, her eyes steady, thoughtful, as if considering not the offer itself, but everything behind it. The room remained silent, waiting. Then she gave a small, almost imperceptible shake of her head. "I am already where I need to be," she said softly. The simplicity of the answer landed with more impact than any elaborate explanation could have. Victor studied her for a moment longer, searching perhaps for something more, but finding only the same calm certainty she had shown from the very beginning. He nodded slowly, accepting it, not as a rejection, but as a truth he could not argue with. "Then I hope," he said quietly, "that wherever that is they know who they have." Emily did not respond with words. She simply gave a small nod, then turned and continued walking, her figure gradually blending back into the background of the room, though now, no one could see her as invisible again. Conversations began to rise, soft at first, then growing, as people turned to one another, sharing what they had just experienced, each trying to put it into words that never quite felt sufficient. Some spoke of the game itself, the precision, the control. Others spoke of her, of the story that had only partially revealed itself. And a few, the ones who had been paying the closest attention, said nothing at all, because they understood that what mattered most was not something that needed to be explained. Victor remained by the table for a while longer, his eyes resting on the board, then lifting toward the space where Emily had disappeared. The pieces were still there, exactly as they had been left, a silent record of what had taken place. He reached out once more, not to change anything, but to lightly touch the edge of the board, as if grounding himself in the reality of it. And in that quiet moment, surrounded by a room that would remember this night for years to come, Victor Hale understood something that no victory had ever taught him. Mastery is not proven by how easily you win, but by how deeply you understand the moment when you are no longer the strongest person in the room. Some moments do not end when people leave the room. They linger, they follow, they settle quietly into the thoughts of everyone who witnessed them. And as the evening continued around him, Victor Hale could feel that this was one of those moments. Conversations had resumed, the soft clinking of glasses returned, and the event slowly found its rhythm again. But something fundamental had shifted beneath it all. People spoke differently now, their voices carrying a new tone, one that balanced admiration with reflection. Across the ballroom, small groups formed, each one retelling what had just happened, each version slightly different, but all circling the same truth. A simple woman had stepped forward, and without raising her voice, without demanding attention, had changed the entire room. Victor remained near the table longer than anyone expected, his presence no longer commanding attention in the same way, but drawing something quieter, a respect that did not need to be announced. A few attendees approached him, offering polite words, careful compliments, but he could sense the difference in their eyes. They were no longer just looking at a grandmaster. They were looking at someone who had been part of something larger than himself. He acknowledged them with nods, with brief responses, but his thoughts were elsewhere. His gaze drifted occasionally toward the edges of the room, searching without urgency, as if hoping to catch one more glimpse of Emily Carter before the night ended. But she was not there. Or perhaps she was, simply unnoticed again, blending into the background as easily as she had before. The idea settled in his mind with quiet clarity. Some people do not disappear because they lack presence. They disappear because they choose not to be seen. Across the room, two younger players stood near a display board, quietly reconstructing the final position from memory, their voices low but intense. "No, look here," one said, adjusting a piece slightly. That move forced everything. There was no way out after that. The other shook his head slowly, studying the board with growing disbelief. "I have seen grandmasters lose before," he said, "but not like that. Not so controlled." Their conversation was echoed in different forms throughout the room, each discussion reinforcing the same realization. This had not been luck. This had not been a mistake. It had been mastery, quiet and undeniable. Victor finally stepped away from the table, his movements unhurried, his posture composed, but his mind still turning over every moment of the game. He had replayed it already, more than once, tracing each decision, each shift in control, each point where the balance had subtly moved beyond his reach. And the more he examined it, the more he understood something that was both humbling and clarifying. She had never been reacting to him. She had been leading him, guiding the game step by step toward an outcome she had already seen. Near the entrance, the event coordinator spoke with a small group, her voice animated, her gestures expressive as she described the match to someone who had arrived late. "It was like watching someone solve a puzzle before anyone else even knew there was one," she said. She did not rush. She did not hesitate. She just knew. Victor paused briefly as he passed, hearing the description, and for the first time since the game ended, a faint smile touched his expression. It was accurate, more accurate than most would realize. He continued toward the edge of the room, his steps measured, his attention shifting from the crowd to the quiet spaces beyond it. And there, near a side hallway, he caught a glimpse of movement. A familiar figure. Emily stood near a service station, placing a folded cloth neatly on a tray, her actions calm, methodical, as if the evening had unfolded exactly as expected and required no further reflection. For a moment, Victor simply watched, not approaching, not interrupting. There was something about the simplicity of the scene that held more meaning than the game itself. The contrast between what she had done and how she carried herself now was not dramatic. It was seamless, as if both versions of her existed naturally, without conflict. Emily finished her task, then turned slightly, her gaze lifting just enough to meet his from across the distance. There was no surprise in her expression, no acknowledgement of the attention that now followed her name. Just the same steady calm. Victor inclined his head slightly, a gesture of respect, quiet but intentional. Emily returned it with a small nod, then turned and walked down the hallway, her figure disappearing from view without hesitation, without pause. And just like that, she was gone again. The hallway remained empty, the soft hum of the event fading behind him, and Victor stood there for a moment longer, absorbing the simplicity of it. No announcement, no farewell, just absence. He turned back toward the ballroom, the sounds of conversation rising once more, and as he re-entered the space, he understood something with complete clarity. Some victories are loud. They demand recognition, applause, acknowledgement. But the most powerful ones do not need any of that. They speak for themselves, quietly, completely, leaving behind something that does not fade when the room moves on. And that night, long after the final move had been made, the silence she left behind said more than any words ever could. By the time the night finally began to wind down, the energy in the room had softened into something reflective, something quieter, as if everyone carried a piece of what they had witnessed and was not quite ready to let it go. Victor Hale stood near the edge of the ballroom once more, no longer searching the crowd, no longer expecting to see Emily Carter return, because he understood now that her presence had never been about staying. It had been about revealing something, and once that was done, there was no reason for her to remain. The chessboard still sat at the center of the room, untouched since the final move, the pieces frozen in their last positions like a silent monument to a truth that could not be undone. A few guests lingered nearby, studying it as if they might uncover something they had missed, something hidden between the lines of the game. But there was nothing hidden. That was the part that stayed with them. It had all been there, move by move, clear and precise, and yet no one had seen it coming. Victor stepped closer to the board again, his gaze settling on the final arrangement, and this time, he did not analyze it as a grandmaster. He looked at it as a reminder, a quiet, unchanging record of a moment when certainty had met something deeper and had been reshaped by it. He reached out, not to move the pieces, but simply to rest his fingers lightly against the edge of the table, grounding himself in the reality of what had happened. Around him, the last conversations of the evening began to fade as people gathered their belongings, their voices softer now, their expressions thoughtful. Some would go home and replay the match in their minds. Others would tell the story, adding their own details, their own interpretations. But no matter how it was told, one thing would remain unchanged. A woman no one had noticed had stepped forward and reminded them all what true mastery looked like. Victor straightened, drawing in a slow breath as he looked around the room one final time. The chandeliers still cast their warm light across polished floors. The chairs were being cleared. The event was ending. But something about the space felt different now, as if it carried a memory that would linger long after the last person had left. He turned toward the exit, his steps measured, unhurried, and as he walked, he passed small fragments of conversation that echoed the same realization in different words. She never rushed. She already knew. It was like watching something unfold that could not be stopped. He did not interrupt. He did not correct them, because for once, there was nothing to explain. Outside, the night air was cool, a quiet contrast to the warmth of the ballroom, and Victor paused for a moment just beyond the doors, looking out at the empty street where the lights reflected softly against the pavement. The world beyond the event continued as it always had, unaware of the shift that had taken place inside. And yet, for those who had been there, it would not feel quite the same again. He adjusted his jacket slightly, a small, familiar gesture, but even that felt different now, less about presentation, more about presence. The certainty that had once defined him had not disappeared, but it had changed, reshaped into something more aware, more grounded. He understood now that mastery was not a fixed position. It was a moving line, one that could be redrawn at any moment by someone willing to step forward without needing recognition. Somewhere in the distance, a car passed quietly, its headlights briefly illuminating the entrance before fading again, and Victor allowed himself a faint, thoughtful smile. Not of victory, not of defeat, but of understanding. Because tonight had not taken anything from him. It had given him something far more valuable. Perspective. He took one final glance back toward the doors, toward the room where everything had unfolded, and then turned away, stepping into the night with a calm he had not carried before. And somewhere, far from the lights, far from the applause, Emily Carter continued her life exactly as she had chosen it, unseen by most, understood by few, but entirely certain of who she was. And that night, without a single word spoken to demand it, the world had been reminded of something it too often forgets. The quietest person in the room is sometimes the one who changes everything.